What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and my regular co-host for that time being is back, Julian. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm honored to be back and looking forward to talking about Babylon. Ready to party.
Yes.
How about you?
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good, thank you. Yeah, we're going to be covering the 2022 film Babylon, starring Margot Robbie, Brad Pitt, Gene Smart, and Diego Calva are the main cast, and then a whole host of other cameos and other bits and pieces going in, both historically and actors. Tobey Maguire appears for a short cameo and bits and pieces like that. Yes, why are we covering this? Well, it's not from the 20th century, but it definitely covers. It's that early period of movies as it transitions from the silent era to the talkies. I think it runs from 1927 to about up to 1952, but the main part is like 1927 to about 1932, 33, focusing on several people that are rise and fall, let's say, of those eras. So Jack Conrad, played by Brad Pitt, a star of the silent era, who is aging out and sort of falls during the sort of talkies. Nellie Delroy, played by Margot Robbie, who is a sort of a starlet that sort of transitions across. And then Diego Calva, who plays Manny Torres, who works his way up through the system to become a studio executive at Kinescope, and then it all goes wrong for him at the end. So they're the sort of main. And also, I do want to sort of hide. There is also Julian Adepo, who plays Sidney Palmer, who is like a trumpet player whose story is it's on the poster. He's kind of a story. It's almost like a B plot within the film, but I would have loved more of that story as well. He's sort of like how the films introduced music and had sort of basically like the early music videos in stories and stuff. And this is
Faye, who's the Chinese American lesbian. She's got a plot too.
Yeah, and there's so many characters like the Ruby, who's the female director, sort of during the 1920s and silent era. This film is an interesting one. So, but basically, yeah, this is two things I want to say. This is a 3 hour and 9 minute film. I had to do it in two sittings. I couldn't do this film in one go. It was kind of a lot. And also, I'm incredibly split on this film. Off air, you used to refer to this as a Marmite film. I've not kind of decided where I think I know where I sit, but I'm not entirely sure yet. But let's go back to you before it. So this is so you we talked about this and you suggest this film, and I'm so glad you did. But what's your sort of history? What's your thoughts on Babylon?
I did not see this in theaters, but I saw it on streaming.
And few people did. Let's be clear. This did not do well.
3 people did. But I mean, I thought it looked interesting. I was kind of looking, it was on my radar, but I didn't see it in theaters. But its themes appealed to me. I mean, I thought it looked shot within an inch of its life, but I hate going to movie theaters, and, so I saw it on streaming, and within the first seconds, I fell in love with it. And I am absolutely in love with it to this day. I think that it is, one of the finest films ever made. I think an argument could be made that it is certainly in the running for finest film ever made. That's how much I love this film. I think that it's not perfect, but I think it sort of ends up sagging a little in the middle as it goes into, sort of like Act 4, Act 5. There's just so much here. But I think that basically everything until the titles, sort of like Act One, is shot for shot, scene for scene, moment to moment, stunningly done. Uh Absolutely gripping. I love all of these characters through the whole film. I think the whole second act with like, her first day on the job is, astounding. I have
Hmm.
staggering, shot after shot after shot. I'm just in absolute awe of how well done this film is. Um and it has a lot of sort of like Tarantino-esque kind of like hijinks and stuff like that, but never becomes Tarantino-esque in the sense of like self-indulgent for its own
Oh,
sake.
okay. I
It's
will argue on that point. I will definitely like. Yeah, no, it's
I think all of those things are subordinated to the plot and its themes and the characters in a way that um is not always the case in, something like Pulp Fiction.
mm,
Um and I think for me, the themes and the characters are so resonant, and it's got, a finale that just, goes for it, you know, uh, is not perfect, but is transcendent, is gutsy. Um, I can't, say enough good about this film. But it's definitely was something that people love or hate.
yeah. No, I tell you what, the this film starts. I have a problem. The problem I have with this film, and I do have problems with this film, but you're right. It is shot with an inch of life. This film has some of my favorite sequences that I've seen in a long time. Like this, there are scenes and sequences in this that are phenomenal. Absolutely, like the choreography that's been put into some of the sort of larger sequences. And you talk about um Nellie Delroy's first day, where it's sort of like in the middle of the desert, and it's like just multiple sets ongoing, and people just sort of like shouting at each other, and it's just like it's just, and she's just stood there like, what the fuck is this? And then just sort of like gets grabbed and like, you're doing this, and it's sort of like there's just sort of like this chaos going on, but there's all these productions going on, and then she sort of clicks in, and she's can all of a sudden like she can do the crying and the dancing, and she's willing to just get stuck into it all. That whole sequence is phenomenal. That, I mean, in and of itself, like you could take
Mhm.
that, and where the director Ruby is saying like, right, give me crying, okay, now less crying, one tear, two tear, and it's like she can do it all. And I love the fact that there's the other actress that's obviously been the sort of like some of the money to it, played by Samara Weaving, and another actress who I adore, by the way. Samara Weaving is great, and she's going to get pissed off because she's getting overshadowed, and this whole thing is wonderfully done. And I think that's the problem I have with this film is there are sequences like that that are phenomenal. And then the next one, it's kind of like, oh, this one doesn't feel like that one. This one's kind of, and there's several scenes that are just jarring. One of them made me angry. One scene in this, one transition in a scene, I had to stop because I was so angry. This film made me, you know, and spoilers by the way, because I do recommend everyone sees this film to determine whether you like it or not. But spoilers, because we're going to talk about everything.
Mhm.
So be warned. Jack Conrad's death at
Mm.
the end of this
Mhm.
film, I came to really like him as a character. I think Brad Pitt is I think Brad Pitt is brilliant in this film
Yeah.
throughout. I think this is one of those things where you go, oh, he's not just a movie star. Like Brad Pitt's an actor, and I think this
Oh,
really sort of,
hell yeah.
I think he's fantastic. But his ending when he sort of like he goes to that party and he sort of realizes he had this conversation with Gene Smart's um, uh, Eleanor St. John, the journalist, and she sort of said like she's laid it out for him like your time has passed. Be
Hmm.
grateful that someone can come across your films in the future. Like you are not this current, the movies have moved on from you. Da, da, da. And he's having to sort of downgrade him to some shitty film that he knows is a piece of shit. And he has these conversations, and everyone's sort of like, pandering to him a bit. And he just sees that bellhop or that sort of person, and he's like, who gave you the best tip? Well, $50, and it was you. And he goes, all right, you're the future, and just gives him this sort of wad of cash and walks off. And you just see him walk into his hotel room, and then you just hear the gunshot. And I was like, fuck. Like it just hit me because I'd spent so much time with this character. Like, I'd watched this film in two sittings, sort of like, so I'd sort of reflected and digested the first half, overnight. And then he commits suicide. And I'm just sort of like, it was a gut punch, like a real gut punch. And then it goes like, wah, 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 wah. And it's all of a sudden Manny running in to grab Nellie. And they're like, we're going to go because we've pissed off some gangsters and we're going to do this. And there's a whole new scene and now we're going to do this. And it's like, fuck, I got no time to reflect or digest what you've just put me through, and now you're going to go on to like your wacky storyline again, and it kind of I literally paused it. I was like, I'm going to walk away from this film because you've just made me angry with how I
It's
feel that you have
interesting.
treated me in this
It's
film.
interesting that you isolate that particular transition.
There's
Is
a
that
couple of others, but that was the one that really stung me.
one of the things that I find most charming about this film is that it's constantly surprising. I
Mm,
mean, even, so some of those transitions that might upset you don't upset me. I mean,
mm,
I like that I don't know what's going on, but what's going on is again just within an inch of its life. Like
mm,
I'm thrown into another situation. I don't know why this is the next thing being presented, but I'm unbelievably enthralled almost immediately and and utterly in this sort of new situation, but I'm not sure why I'm being given this. But by the end, I have total confidence in those choices. That's very rare for me,
mm,
as a writer and as a critic. I do think that that particular moment and that particular transition is the sort of weak juncture of the entire film.
mm,
And it's something that really bothered me the first time through. Um, where I think that throughout the sort of first sequence, you get that title unbelievably late, which is like,
ace, love
again,
it.
shocking,
Yeah.
and then you go right to the first day, which nobody ever shows, right? You'd normally just cut all this out, but you think, is this a mistake? But it's done phenomenally. You have all those tracking shots that are just, tell you more with the shot.
Mm,
Like, I mean, it's unbelievable they got any of this. And ends with that, kiss on the bluffs, and I mean,
yeah.
everything is just so perfect. And I do think that it loses some of that energy as it goes on. But I think that particular moment, I think partly because it doesn't give you time to grieve, but also because it seems like it's a rupture in the narrative for me that suddenly Nellie is in trouble and you've got this other plot to deal with. And
Hmm.
it feels as if, well, it feels as if I should see that she got in trouble, right? I should see more of this connective tissue there. And maybe, 5 minutes, between those two scenes would help a lot. It just sort of feels like that comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Uh, You sort of are more on the side of needing time to grieve, and I'm sort of more on the side of wanting a transition with Nelly. Um, but the more that I have watched it, and I've seen it several times now, the more I feel like that is the right choice, or at least I understand it.
Mm.
That that was probably the moment that most bothered me um, early on. And now I sort of feel like, yeah, it doesn't give you time to grieve, but the movie has always been sort of frenetic on to the next thing. It's that the next thing is such a radical departure. Um, but now I feel like, no, this is exactly how it would go with Nelly.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm fine with the characters. And I think this is some of the problems I have with this film, and this is where I waver because I think some of it is
Mhm.
shot so, and some of the dialogue is awesome as well. Like there are certain exchanges that I just find, and I think Brad Pitt's Jack Conrad is my favorite character in this film. I just find him fascinating. This kind of like clinging on to, they're trying to sort of as a technology transitions, this kind of like clinging on and sort of going like, no, you don't step it, you don't stand in the way of progress. You've got to change and adapt. But like, the struggle he has with it and stuff,
And
and
he's a
being laughed at.
visionary, you know.
Yeah, yeah, he
Yeah.
wants to do these things, but then
He
he sees that.
wants cinema to be art.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that conversation with his Broadway wife when he's like, no, when his friend George dies, again, another one where I'm like, that scene is just fucks like hits. It's like, George has been his best friend. He's the first person that told him he has talent. And he gets the phone call, and the first thing he does is turn on her, and he's like, fuck you. This is high art because people put their effort into this. 100,000 people come see you on the stage, and you're a hit. 100,000 people see me, I'm a flop. And he's like this thing of like, I provide entertainment, and the passion he has with that, and this sort of, and I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, you're right. Like, he's like, I provide like hundreds of jobs. We do this, and I was kind of like, it just sort of resonates with me, that character, like that passion and that visionary that he has, and so that's why I was sort of following along with him. So his demise really fucking hit me.
But if I could just interrupt for a second, like, part of what I love about this, I love all the themes. I think this is one of the most thought out and complex movies in terms of all of the themes that it has to present that I've ever seen. And even that is a defensive speech by Conrad. He's defensive and he's partly right, but he's partly wrong, right? I mean, he's wrong in that, it's like, well, I'm a popular medium, I provide jobs. This is all defensive bullshit, right? That's not really
he's justifying himself in his grief, but
right. But beneath that is a real argument about, yes, this is a popular medium, but I see how it can be art, and I'm trying to elevate it, and I know it's not Broadway yet, but it can be, and I'm making steps in that direction. But in the meantime, I'm taking this populist sort of like, well, how many comics did your comics sell? Like, yeah, that's very defensive nonsense. But it's that mix, cast in this very human moment. And I love that, I don't know. I mean, I love the complexity of that a character can be right and admirable and beautiful, and at the same time wrong and defensive and hurt and a failure, and I think all of the characters resonate for me like that.
I do think the characters are good, and I think this is the thing, like, there's a complexity to this of, this, I want to love this film. And this is the problem. I really want to love this film. I think all the main cast in this are great. Like, I don't know, I know Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt, obviously, but like the other main guy who I mentioned, Diego Calva. Yeah, Manny. I don't know much about him, but I think he's great as well. I think he's fantastic in this film. All the characters in this are human. And what I mean by that is, because clearly they're played by people, but like they are human in the fact that they are complex. There are times when they are very good and they are very admirable, but then there are also times when they are absolute douchebags. Like every single one of them, like, is an absolute douchebag at some point, and manipulative, and that's how the Hollywood machine works. Another, the scenes where Manny goes about sort of doing things just to get people to do what he wants them to do, to get things, or he'll do certain things for people to get himself up on his career ladder. The scene where sort of Jack Conrad calls, I forget the name of the actress, but some actress who thinks she's an A-lister, and then basically cons her into joining a film for like a pay cut and stuff, and that, like, and the same, like, and the same with Nellie Delroy.
Typical
like
Hollywood, right?
100%. Like Nellie Delroy does the same thing. Like, she'll manipulate, and you see that sort of like she's hurt and she sort of wants to prove herself, but then like you also see how she sort of like respects her dad, but not her mum, although her mum suffers from mental illness and all this other stuff. Like, there's some really complexities to these characters, and I love all that.
And she's got so much confidence, but she hates herself,
Yeah, no, really, that's it. Like, there's this.
And she's a train wreck. I mean,
oh, absolutely,
but a beautiful, talented train wreck.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You can see that, and I can see, and Margot Robbie's fantastic in this. Like, again, the main cast in this are fantastic. And I love some of these scenes, especially when they do have those human moments. And there are scenes when it's incredibly frenetic, and I'm sort of in it. Like even the main opening party is good. The problem I have with this, and this is the director's fault, is I would say the tone of the humor. The humor is the biggest flaw in this film, because there are times when it's incredibly well done. There are moments when the humor is really fun. It's legit funny. And then, but the fact that this film basically opens with an elephant shitting on a guy, And I'm like, oh, all right, this is kind of like almost like a Jackass film. Like this is how I would expect Johnny Knoxville to run out and be like, "Hi, I'm Johnny Knoxville. This is elephant shit." Like do you know what I mean? Like it feels like that. And then the same happens again when Nellie Delroy talks about fighting a snake. And
Hmm.
she's like, fine, I'll fucking fight it. And so she storms out and grabs the snake. And then the rattler sort of like shooting at and biting her in the neck. And she's running around with it flapping around. I'm like, this is like The Hangover. I can expect sort of like Zach Galifianakis, what's it face doing this? This is a stunt from like a Jackass film or like a silly sort of hangover movie. Like it feels so out of place. The humor's kind of like because then it sort of it just then that descends into the thing and then Jack Conrad runs out, he's like, I'll save the day, but then gets hit by a car and you're like, it's not just chaotic, as in like that's there are certain scenes that are chaotic and funny when they're well choreographed, like the openings you said that day one on the silent set, but then
Hmm.
also day one when they're trying to do the sound film and like the shoes have a certain the shoes
Mm.
you have to have rubber soles, and that guy who's the production assistant gets increasingly like in like apoplectic with rage at everything that keeps going wrong. That's hilarious. Like that had I was like that's such a well done scene, but
Hmm.
then it will go off and veer off into some sort of like there'll be like crazy antics. But there's other scenes like when they talk about why would you want. There's a great scene in a bathroom where they say, "Well, why do you want sound in your film?" But while they're and he's like, "Well, it's the future. It's amazing. Why wouldn't you want sound in your film?" It's accompanied by someone taking a shit, and you
Yeah.
can hear it. And I'm like, "That's what you need. That's funny. That's satire. That's clever." The other bits kind of just feel almost too much. Do you know what I mean? Like
Well,
the
sort of like
film.
Tarantino-esque, kind of over the top. I mean, and
Yes.
I know what you're
It
saying.
veers from Scorsese to Tarantino to and then beyond a little bit, and that's where it lost me.
Okay, I respect what you're saying.
Mm.
I disagree. I mean, with an exception. So I mean, right from the beginning, I understood that the elephant shitting, and I've had other people react to like their sort of initial response to the elephant shitting, is like, oh, this is kind of like a gross out, sort of like lowbrow kind of thing. Right. I instantly understood, that I know this sounds so arrogant, but I instantly understood just the way it is shot. This is and the way the characters are depicted, that this is a high art depiction, right? So like even though what's being shown is sort of like jackass kind of stuff, it's first of all, it's shot astoundingly well. It's edited astoundingly well. Every bit of music, every second of celluloid is, it's not celluloid anymore, but I mean, is perfectly artistically chosen. I see the deliberate intent. I see the masterful work being done here on that detailed level. But then also, that's about Manny's character, right? So it's a gross out moment, but it's not a gross out moment for the sake of a gross out moment. It's a gross out moment for, I mean, somebody, they say somebody eating shit. This is somebody literally dealing with shit who is a minority character struggling to make his break, doing whatever it takes and getting the job fucking done, which is what you need on a film production. And that shit isn't just a funny little gag. I don't see it as a funny gag at all, really. I see it as, a um sort of, slightly exaggerated, but not much. Demonstration of character, of social situation, of, how Hollywood works, of, what is expected of minorities versus non-minorities. I mean, for me, I could dissect, 5 levels at which that shit is
Yeah.
functioning, and all of which work.
But I
And,
think the thing is, everything you're saying though, I see what you're saying, and I can see that as a depiction. However, everything you've just said though, I then think is replicated in the party.
mhm.
Manny is treated like he is the cleanup guy for everything at the party as well. And I think so. Everything you're saying is then shown during the party sequence. Like, there's the fat guy who's getting peed on, who then ends up sort of like punching or the hooker ends up taking overdosing, so they've got to clean that
Mhm.
up. There's also all these other sort of the debaucherous things that's going on, like where are the drugs? He then gets referred to as like a guy says to him, "You're Mexican." He's like, "No, I'm Spanish." And there's all these things of like just all those stuff you're saying is then shown better, in my opinion, throughout that scene. Where by the end of it, you're like, oh yeah, he's the dog's body. Like he's clearly the runner of all this, and everybody else gets to sort of get fucked up, and he has to clean up the mess. Like
And
in
has to
order
work
to,
twice as hard. And
yeah. I mean, the elephant is
yeah,
there for the gag, so they can get the dead hooker out of the or the dead girl out of the party. So they use the elephant as a distraction.
but it's also symbolic of the prestige of that party, and to be able to command an elephant, right?
Mm,
It's like, Prince wants a tiger tonight,
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it's that sort of you know,
Mm,
power, an arbitrary power. But I mean, you're right. It's not that those things aren't illustrated in other ways too. But each time they're illustrated in a different context with different points being made. Like, you mentioned, Mexican being Spanish. Well, versus Spanish. Well, that goes back to, the history of California,
mm,
as a state and as a territory. And how the white population could not distinguish between, the Mexican population and the population that were descended from the Spanish colonizers,
mm.
all of which were the same to, the gringo Americans who were like, you speak Spanish, you're the same to us, but
Yeah.
who had totally separate cultures, and
Mm.
those, let alone the native population, but all of that was elided as like this other, right? And so that whole history is invoked there. So, I mean, for me, which is about place and about, again, race and, power and all these things. So you're right. It's not that those things aren't illustrated in other ways. It's just that for me, like when people deride something as a gross out, right? Um, you know, there are gross out moments, where you say, oh, does somebody need to projectile vomit, right? I mean, we have a moment like that in
Hmm.
this. Um, there are movies that have gross out scenes where really it's just about the gag, right? And maybe the underlying, if there is any underlying message, it's this character's a fuck up, or something like that. Sometimes there's not even an underlying message. But if it's just for a character, just for a plot point, like that's at least it serves some function. In this movie, where you have those elements, usually they're serving like six functions simultaneously. They're serving like thematic functions, they're serving symbolic functions, they're serving character functions, they're serving, social functions, they're serving, world building functions. Like
But I think
they're
that
setting up a gun that's going to go off in Act Three. And I love that fact that even those gross out moments are doing so much work and are resonant in this deep way for me.
I know I agree to an extent with what you're saying with some of those
Yeah.
scenes. And again, that the vomit scene with Nellie Delroy later on,
It's a
again,
little more of a gross out.
it
Yeah.
is, yeah. And again, it's not so much the fact she's sick, it's the way that they show it. Again, it's sort of like, oh, that projectile vomit is verging on comedy, but like
Hmm.
like you say, like American Pie or the Hangover kind of I'm like, okay. But I get why that whole scene makes sense. But here's the issue I have again. Not one of the bigger issues, because I do want to talk about some of the cast actually as well. But I keep talking about Nellie Delroy. This period in history is incredibly complex. The
Yeah.
period that it covers, and some of the reasons, and one of the things that sort of like this hour is over 3 hours long. This film is over 3 hours. It's got and so much stuff in it, but it's also like missing massive chunks of history that were massively impacting the entertainment industry in California. It alludes to the Hayes Code, but never mentions
Hmm.
Hayes. Like it
Yeah.
never gets to it, and I'm like, why have we not talked about the moral crusading of all these people that actually happened in California? That should be a massive point. It
Yeah, you
goes
see
from
the effect of it, but you don't really see
they
it
talk
happening,
exactly.
or they don't even talk about it quite as directly
No,
as they probably
but
should.
how the studios have
Yeah.
protested, how these things were happening. There were events that happened that drove those things forward. But also,
Hmm.
like the stock market crash of 29, massive impact on. This is why when you have Nellie Delroy and all the actors going to those parties to influence people to invest in film because they're the only people with money.
Hmm.
And that's all to do with the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at it again and go like, well, the problem I had was repeatedly I was going, there's parts of this missing. This would have benefited from being a 6 hour mini series on like a prestige mini series of like I'd like a much
Yeah.
bigger keep the prestige element, keep all the craziness, but like I need you to tell me more because you're kind of you're going really deep into some things like the minutiae of detail of how a set works, which is
Hmm.
great, but you're kind of missing other points that would have affected people like Nellie Delroy and Jack Conrad and all these other characters. And there's a great moment later on with the trumpeter, what's it, Palmer, when they're like,
Hmm.
oh, the light makes him too light. He'll look like a
Yeah.
mixed race band. Can you darken your skin? And I'm like, fuck, that's crazy. Can we then get into how blacks were, these African Americans were being treated in the 20s and 30s? Like, oh, I want to know more about that. Let's have a
Yeah,
look
I
at
mean,
it.
okay, there's only so much that you can put in a
Yeah, I
movie,
know.
right? I mean, I don't want this to be a miniseries. I know what you mean. I do think it has kind of like episodes within it.
Yeah.
Um, acts or episodes within it. And to get back to this point about tone, I do think that that shift from suicide to Nellie's emergency is one of those shifts where not just the context, the content changes so dramatically. There's a new sort of backstory you've got to absorb while you're trying to process the last scene, and the tone becomes almost surreal with this
Mm.
sort of like underground, Tobey Maguire's amazing.
Yeah.
As he usually is, but this sort of like underground, very sort of Dante's Inferno-esque underworld to
I
Hollywood,
love
which
this when
is,
they're like, oh, not this floor, down one more. And they have to keep going. Yeah,
and
excellent.
and it and again it fits symbolically, and it fits thematically, but it feels very over the top, especially compared to the last stuff. It feels more Tarantino-esque.
Hmm.
So I do agree, to a certain point with that, your point that you're making about tone. I think for me, it's usually, if what I'm getting is of a piece, at least thematically and symbolically and whatnot, with the rest of the film, and if it is well done, I'm usually willing to go along with it. And I have more of I think that, it's interesting as we talk about movies, like what we're willing to swallow, right? Like there are a lot of like plot points that
Hmm.
I can't swallow in other movies that other people can swallow.
Yeah.
I'm usually a sucker for like a well-directed sequence with, stunning visuals combined with stunning audio, and if it doesn't quite fit, maybe we don't need another dream sequence, but this is fucking amazing and it does fit with the overall thing, and I'm not going to object. So I'm maybe a little more comfortable with those incongruities, in my own tolerance. But I do think that is the biggest sort of shift.
Mm.
Um, yeah, as far as the like you were saying, like the historical stuff, I agree. I sort of feel like there are, especially, in the middle section, there are these sort of time jumps, and there are these sections. I don't think this needs to, I love that this is sort of like an epic movie
Mm.
about this, about this specific period and these specific themes. I don't want it to be sort of like reduced to in scope to in to a series, right? Um, but I do think that it could stand to have, 20, 30 more minutes, of some of this connective tissue and some of that historical context. Um, so I do agree with that. And the thing about the blackface thing, which is heartbreaking,
Hmm.
again, goes back to, the era of the Hays Code, and what Southern audiences expect, and this larger story that's being told, which I think is really the story of, it's been the story of my life, but it's the story of most industries, most companies, of this sort of like early period of wild excess and
Yeah.
tolerance and energy, and a sort of like great anything goes liberalism that is combined with extreme abuses of power because nobody's watching. And that nobody's watching effect allows for great tolerance, but also great abuses. And as things become codified, it's more of an industry. You're worried about audiences more. There's a
Mm.
code now, and so
An unofficial
obviously
code. I mean,
certain
it's that thing of
people
like, yeah. I mean,
suffer more than others.
yeah. I mean, the Hayes Code is a fascinating thing in and of
Mhm.
itself. I mean, that would you could do a whole film about how Hayes and his minions caused havoc and really put pressure on people in that sort of during the late 20s and 30s. Um,
And
but
totally repugnant, let's
oh
be
yeah,
crystal
oh no,
clear.
100%. Like it was, it's no different to the sort of moral panics of the we suffer today. Um, I do find this whole thing. I do like this sort of the debauchery that goes with it, though. Like you say, the sort of the early days, and one of the things I find that I don't think gets recognised enough when you see films like this is how young cinema was. Like really, like and I know that filming had been around for like since the late 19th century, but actual like films, like there was sort of like serials and that sort of thing had really only hit strong in cinemas, like 1910 to 1912, sort of like was really when the sort of serials hit, and films were like an hour, if that, and then they sort of worked from there. So really, like cinema didn't hit its stride until sort of like the middle of the sort of 19 teens, really. And so the cinema was hit big fast, and that's the thing is sort of like is kind of alluded to at the beginning of this, especially with Day One for Nelly Delroy, is they hit it fast and hard. They were like, "This is popular, and we've got to keep providing stuff for new stuff for people as fast as possible." And what I thought was funny, and it's not sort of, it struck me how similar streaming services are to like early cinema, where these studios were like, we've got to keep giving people new things. They got to have something new every week. We want to see a new film out every week. Like I did a little bit of like just reading up and stuff, and some of these people, like Jack Conrad and these other actors, the reason they were
Mhm.
so messed up is like they were making like dozens of films a year.
Yes, absolutely. Even
Like,
directors were directing, a dozen movies a year back then.
yeah, and multiple. Some of them were like, right, I finished this one to tomorrow, next one. There was no break. Like this was like a factory. They were really pumping. So they worked hard and they played hard. That was this sort of thing of like what the movie industry was. And people don't sort of respect that. Like you talk about like lost movies. We say, oh yes,
Hmm.
sort of like this renowned horror film of whatever's been lost. Yeah, hundreds of films have been lost. Like there are hundreds of films that were made, in the sort of like from 1915 to 1930 that just sort of like studios were like, we don't have the room for this, we don't know how to use it anymore, bin it. Like stuff just got binned. So like a lot
Hmm.
of this was kind of seen as disposable.
Hmm.
And you do see that with streaming services now, where they're like, we've got to keep making new things. What's going to be the next bingeable hit? What's the next thing? Like, they've got to keep plowing these things through. So I love that. And I think there was it's again, from my point of view, I know you said you wouldn't want the scope to increase, but this is where I'm looking at this and going like, I want to know more. Like, I want to see why these things are the way they are. Um, and so yeah, there was just this fascinating sort of thing of like cinema. Like you look at this and you go like, oh yeah, it's established. No, this was like the Wild West. Like it was in like it was exactly as they saw it. Like people were injured every day. People like got killed.
So many people die in this
Yeah.
movie. Like it's amazing. Like so many people die and are not mourned and are not
No,
remembered.
one of my favorite again. Like no, there's a great scene. The German visionary director. And again they're poking fun at the German expressionism from sort of like um Cabinet of Caligari and all these kinds of films that were made at the time. I love the fact that at one point one guy's just got a spear through him, and they're like, "Well, he was a drinker. He probably ran into it himself." They fully justify it, and they just move on.
Hmm.
So, but all that,
Life
like,
was cheap, right?
oh
And in the
yeah,
early days of any medium. I mean, and to your point, like I think one thing that this really depicts is like how rapid it was, but also
mm,
how rapidly changing that landscape
mm,
is. That the things that made you like the it girl for that year might be totally different in 2 years, and almost certainly are going to be totally different in five. Like nobody
mm,
knows if cinema's going to be a thing in 5 years, right? Like this crazy early era. Um, but I know what you're saying with the streaming comparison, but I also think like, in the history of art, right? You're right that cinema is new,
Mm.
relatively speaking. But in the history of art, you think about how each art form, I mean, at a certain point there weren't printed books, right? You have printed books, lots of things become possible. When, plays become, plays, you think of how amazing a play is, right? Like at some point that was cutting edge technology.
Mm.
Like, you can move sets around. You can, especially, I mean, the classical drama took place over the course of a day, close to real time, one setting, one limited cast. You get to the Elizabethan stage, and it's like, I mean, people complained and said, like, we were in Venice 1 minute and then we were in
Yeah.
London the next. How do they expect us to buy that?
Well, that was one of the
Like,
big things of like the Globe Theatre, isn't it? Like the winches and pulleys that were able to do these things with the sets and change the lighting colours and stuff was like that was, as you say, cutting technology. So yeah.
but then to get this medium that, when we talk about streaming and we talk about, YouTube and TikTok, that's cinema.
Mm.
All of that is this same medium, this same invention that to this day, until we get holographic displays or something, is still like the medium that, reaches the vast amount of audiences, and is able to communicate in this super direct, super emotionally affecting way. I mean, when the president gives a speech, he's making a movie,
Mm.
I mean, it's all visual now. And this was the moment at which, like, you think of human history, this medium that was going to take over everything in ways that
Yeah.
we can't even understand or disentangle anymore, was really still in its infancy and really striving to be something greater and falling on its face,
Mm. Yeah.
yeah. So
Well,
I don't know. I find it fascinating.
no, it is. It's true, and I think that there's at least one moment when someone says, "Well, that's Hollywood," and it's getting stale, isn't it? And you're thinking, "This is 1932. Like, this is clearly when things change." But I think this also comes to the pace of the film, which again I think is again both um, it's a double-edged sword, really, because it is. Like I said, it's quite relentless. The film is very relentless. A lot goes on in over 3 hours. But it also means there are certain scenes. I've also I've mentioned obviously the Jack Conrad suicide, which sort of bothered me, but one that less bothered me, but I felt didn't get the sort of the weight and impact that it needed, and I feel it should have been comparable to the end. I think the end scene with Manny in 52 going into a cinema, and I think it's almost well I'll wait for that, but I felt that scene was brilliant. He sort of sees singing in the rain and stuff, and we'll talk about that, but the scene where he goes in and he sees the jazz singer for the first time, and he's obviously been working with Jack Conrad. It's all been the sort of like the silent movies, and he steps in, and all of a sudden you've got like the jazz singer on screen. And this guy's singing and dancing, and the audience are like stood up, clapping and applauding and hollering. And Manny sort of sees it and just runs out and calls Jack, and he's like, "Everything's gonna change." Um, but then it flicks. It's like it's literally like it's about a minute in this massive film, and I'm like, that feels like that scene is a pivot point, and it should have so much more weight, and it feels kind of disposable in this massive film. And I'm like, especially in Manny's story, like he's the one that because Manny's kind of on the ball with a lot of this stuff. He's the one that sees it and goes like, oh no, I get how big some of this stuff is. And I was kind of disappointed that scene was like done, right, move on, clip and that sort of thing.
I agree with you. Yeah, Manny is the main character, right?
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
audience
there
association
is
character. Yeah.
yeah, and and he's there at the beginning, he's there at the end.
Mm.
And I agree with you. I think that again, like you should see more of the impact of that. I think there's a lot of this kind of like connective tissue that's kind of like missing, especially in that whole section,
Mm.
where you've sort of made to understand that Manny has risen in Hollywood, right, and
Mm,
has influence. But there's a lot of just kind of like depicting that rise, and seeing the effect of the talkies and all of this, where you just get to a point in this movie where it's got to jump forward in time,
yes.
right? And I think that I love the frenetic pace. I mean, first of
Mm,
all of my favorite movies tend to be frenetic audiovisual extravaganzas, and this is no exception. But I do agree with you that it does feel not like there's scenes missing, but that there are cuts where the weight of those cuts isn't as apparent as it should be,
yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's it. I think, like, there is that film that there's a version of this that's 3.5 hours long, and there's certain scenes like that probably have just that couple of extra seconds where you see the impact more or so.
Or a minute like montage sequence between stuff where you see, just like Manny being a boss now,
Yes.
and yeah, you could do that very comedically and very cinematically.
Mm,
And a little bit of that here and there would do wonders for this movie.
yes. One thing I wanted to throw out about this film, about the cast, despite them all being very good at what they do, um, and I do think, like, again, Brad Pitt. I think this film has made me want to watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I'm not. I'm not a huge Tarantino fan, so I've not really been bothered to watch it, but I kind of want to. It's made me appreciate Brad Pitt a bit more. I think Margot Robbie is very good anyway. I've seen her sort of do lots of different bits and pieces. I think the fact that she has to do the Brooklyn accent in this kind of leans her into Harley Quinn a little bit, which is unfortunate. But there are two people in this film that kind of pull me out of it. The first is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, playing one of the studio executives in the first half of the film, and I'm like,
Hmm.
I know who you are, and it's kind of weird. I'm like, I know you're Flea, and you look very modern. But the other one is Margot Robbie, and the reason
Hmm.
for that is every era has a beauty standard, and I think it's good for men and women, but I think Brad Pitt, they make him look like a 20s. He looks enough like Clark Gable-ish that you can sort of go, okay, they've pulled him back into that era and all that kind of thing. I just find the fact that, like, so Nellie Delroy is based on a woman called Clara Bow, who
Vaguely, yeah. I
vaguely, like,
mean,
yeah, there was
yeah.
bits of things that happened in Nellie Delroy's career happened in Clara Bow's career. Like, she's the template, if you will, for those sorts of things.
Hmm.
But I googled her and I was like, okay, let's have a look. She looks very
Yeah.
1920s. She's got the bob and she looks like, she's got the Betty Boo look kind of thing sort of going on at times, and she was very much at that time. Margot Robbie just never looks like she hasn't stepped out of the 2020s to me. And it could just be this could be the Tiffany effect. Um, that I'm playing it because I've seen her this, but like she never doesn't look like a modern beautiful woman, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but others do look like they're from the 20s. Like, they give, Samara Weaving, when they sort of have her play the part, she has that sort of the 20s haircut and the 20s cut. The same with the Ruby, who's the director. So a lot of people around her look like they're in the 1920s. But yeah, Margot Robbie kind of looks like she's gone from this straight to Barbie, or straight to sort of Suicide Squad. Do you know what I mean? I can't. Where I can see
I know
the
what
others.
you mean.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of.
I know what you
Well,
mean. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, I think that if you're going to choose someone, I mean, so if you look at Claire Bow and you look at like the body types, especially that were
mm,
popular then, so the body type, especially in the 20s, was the flapper, right?
yes,
Which tended to be very thin,
yes,
which she fits that type. Um, most of Hollywood history, you could not have cast, a Hollywood starlet in that one of those roles. Um, so I think to me, in some ways she fits, and in some ways she doesn't. You're right, the hair is different, right?
hmm
Um, but I do think that there are certain anachronisms that, I mean, like the extent of cocaine, right? Like, well, the audience probably wouldn't understand, the
Yeah.
equivalent, but the audience understands cocaine. I mean, there are certain anachronisms that, like, while not offensive, are potentially distracting, or,
It's the Tiffany
and
effect. It's called the Tiffany
yeah,
effect. It's just for audience. Do you know what this is?
explain it. No.
Okay, so I only learned about this not that long ago, and it's a fascinating thing. So the Tiffany effect was created by some guy in the 1990s, and basically he wrote a character to be set in the 14th century called Tiffany, and everyone was like, "You can't call her that. That's a modern name." And he was like, "Actually, the first recording of the use of the name Tiffany comes from the 12th century." So it was like,
Hmm.
so actually, it is historically accurate, but because we associate that name so readily with the modern world, you cannot use that as a historical
Hmm.
name. And so they refer to it as the Tiffany effect, is when you use something which is historically accurate, but doesn't work for the audience because they think of it as being, as you said, would be anachronistic. So they'd go, "Oh, I don't know that thing, so I'm assuming it's modern." Or, you know what I mean? Like we would say, we
Hmm.
would understand what you would design and present as, say, a Victorian study is what we would expect as a Victorian study, but it might not be what an actual Victorian study looked like. It's that kind of thing. So you have
Right.
to be very
Yeah.
careful about what you put in. And the drugs you mentioned is actually a really good point, because I read about that. That like
Hmm.
cocaine wasn't as readily available as it's shown in this film. Other drugs were opioids and other things, but because they're associated with modern, the director says because they're more associated with modern epidemics of drugs, they lent into cocaine because everyone knows that, and it's
Right.
easier to explain than going, oh
Yeah,
no,
and
this was
it's
there
not
and that's not.
wrong. I mean,
No,
I think like her, right? These anachronisms are sort of like, they're not wrong. They're not true anachronisms,
mm,
right? But they're, like you're saying, you could call it the Tiffany effect, where it's like, they're not wrong. They're not real anachronisms, but they feel a little out of place,
yes,
right?
exactly that.
And it's like you're saying, like leaning into the cocaine. I mean, another example is like when were making Deadwood, right? Like people say,
Mm.
fuck, you know, right? Because saying, it's our nation doesn't
Yeah,
sound as terrible, right?
yeah, exactly.
It sounds like Yosemite Sam or something, right? Like it sounds silly. But that's what people said when they got mad
Yeah,
back then, like that was a curse word,
yeah,
So you have to change that, right?
yes,
So yeah, there are things like this that, you know, I mean, it's the same thing like when we do a lot of science fiction where we're watching a lot of, or movies set in other countries where sometimes, you're hearing English and you'll think, like, right, you've got to stay away from the pun, right? Because that only works in English.
hmm,
But there are certain phrases that we use or connections that we make that are clearly English that you can't avoid, right? It's like expressions, things like this. You're
yeah,
always watching like a translation of the original, and I think there's this weird kind of veil over all art where you have
yes,
to say fundamentally it is artifice and you're kind of watching a translation of something anyway.
yes, an
And this is kind
adaptation
of like
enough.
within bounds, but I know what you're saying of like it can feel a little strange here and there.
Yeah, I mean her performance transcends it. I think she's
Yeah.
excellent, and so it sort of I fall into the groove of just going, yeah, she's fine. It sort of it never sort of, but it kind of initially took me out of it a little bit. Um, I like her ending as well. I want to say, like, this goes back to this idea of like the Tarantino versus Scorsese kind of thing of like, she has the whole fuck up where she's got a gambling habit and she owes 85 grand to um Toby Maguire in a wonderful cameo performance that you sort of, as you say, and then they
Toby
go,
Maguire needs to play evil more often. Is
oh,
my takeaway.
he's
He's so swarmy.
yeah, he's so fun in this film, and I love some of the little again, like just some of the little factors, like they meet him and he is vile, like vile looking and vile sort of behavior, and he drinks this drink that's brandy and ethanol. Like, yeah, that just sounds awful. That just sounds horrendous. But then they say, "Oh, we're going to go to this party, and you've got to come and see this guy." Like we've gone back to the debauchery beforehand. It's sort of hidden, but it's kind of here. And instantly he starts putting on this kind of like foundation to hide, to blend in his skin color because he's got like jaundice eyes and all this other stuff. Like he's clearly diseased, and so he's wearing makeup to hide his pallid thing. But there's no sort of like, it's never pointed out. He just starts doing it, and I was just like, again, as you said, it's sort of like there's just little bits of things like that where you go like, that's really cool. Like they're not making a big deal of it. It's not being pointed out, but it's there. That like, things like that were brilliant. But her ending when they have to run, and it ends with her being incredibly happy. She's going to be married to Manny. They're now engaged, and then she just sort of walks into the shadows.
Well, they're fleeing Hollywood, right?
Yes.
So sort of like the end of that dream, which was a dream for the two of them, but
Mm.
Manny's finally going to get the girl that he's been in love with, right?
But years.
And
Yeah.
she's finally going to, at least since the beginning of the movie,
Mm.
and she's finally going to, settle down, right? Like, their careers are over, hers especially. We've seen the attempt to resurrect it that's
Yeah.
failed dramatically. Um, and there's a settling down there. There's a sort of like a recognition of age, a recognition of having had that glorious time in the light that's passed, that I think is one of the hardest things about aging. Certainly
Mm.
very hard for highly achieving people like athletes and celebrities. I mean, um, is a brutal thing. But there is a plan here, right? That sounds like it could be a happy ending for both of them. Maybe a settling down for her, letting herself be loved, making healthier choices, certainly. Um, and in his case, getting the girl that he's really loved all along and that is really more important to him than this great Hollywood career
Mm.
he's had. Um, and they're ready to do it, right? I mean, they've gotten away. They're ready to do it. And she just dances off into the light.
Into the, well, through the light into the
Yeah.
dark. And then then he comes out, can't find it, and I love that again. This what I was saying about like some of the way it's shot, like some of the scenes in this, some of the shooting, like you said, edited within, like shot within an inch of its life. But the lighting, as you say, sort of like she's happy and dancing in the light, and then just is enveloped by the shadow, like not just walking into the darkness, like she disappears into the shadow, and then when Manny comes out, like she's nowhere to be found, and he has to run for it because he's had a gun in his face and been told to leave LA. Um, But what I found was what's the real heartbreak of it is you then get this sort of like montage of a newspaper, and it's like it's sort of a big, I forgot the big headline is, and then it just sort of zips down to like a corner piece, and it's like former starlet found dead, age 34, and that's it. Like she was this thing before that was all headlines and she was all over the news and everything, and now she's just this. Her obituary is sort of like an inch and a half in the corner of a newspaper, and she's just known as former starlet, dies age 30, body found age 34. And you're just like, fuck, that's, you know, gut wrenching.
Yeah,
Um,
brutal.
and so I
But it
love,
also seems perfect. I mean, it's just it's choices like that that I see throughout this movie that are just, especially, as a writer, that I just think, my God, that's perfect.
mm,
Like that's so well done and also so gutsy. Like,
mm,
I mean, it risks having her be a part of his story. I mean, he is the main character, but it risks marginalizing her, the most prominent female character, to have her disappear like this and then die off screen.
yeah,
I mean, this is Margot Robbie dies off
yeah,
screen. Um, but it does seem perfect for her that
it does.
she disappears in that light, the way the world sees her and the way the world remembers her. And the real Nellie, God only knows what she really went through before the movie begins. It was probably awful.
Yeah.
And what she went through after she disappears into that darkness.
Well, I think the
But,
thing, I think it's that moment of darkness, what it comes is because there's a bit when that moment, as I say, when Manny sort of turns up, the bit I was annoyed about, the one that where he breaks into from Jack's death. He's sort of saying, "We've got to run, we've got to move, we've got to do this," da da da. And there's a moment where she's like, "No, I've kind of made peace with this.
Yeah.
Like, I fucked up. My career is over. I've had this time to reflect on everything that's happened, and I'm kind of at peace with dying at this point. Like, I've lived a hard, incredible life." And she sort of says that and I kind of feel that, like, him agreeing to marry her and sort of like, it's almost for her, it feels like many of the things are in this film a double-edged sword. In that, like, for her, it's acknowledgement that someone loves her and gives her some sort of validation that she can be loved and she could have that life that she wants, and that's what makes her happy. But she also she doesn't dance off by accident.
Mm.
The dancing away into the darkness is kind of like, but I don't want to mess that up. This is a perfect moment for her in that way of like, I've been able to break away from everything, but I know I know I can't do it because I need the drink, the drugs, the gambling, the starlight. I need all that. And so I'm only going to make this is only going to become worse. I think she recognizes there's almost like almost maybe an unconscious recognition of that. And so her dancing away, being happy with the moment to die, is almost like, allowing Manny to escape, but her having this perfect moment of being loved and being given the option and someone else sacrificing for her, only for her to die. And she said, "You don't know how she dies." We kind of, I'm assuming it's going to be just sort of shot or whatever. But I don't know. It
I
kind of
assume it's
feels
a
like,
drug overdose,
yeah,
but
or it could be anything. Like yeah, you don't know that she hasn't gone back to that dance hall where she's just going to sort of like overdose and die on her terms. But it feels like that's what it was supposed to be. Like she's taken that moment and sort of then going to be greeting her death on her terms. And that was what I thought was really interesting. And then for it to be just this little corner piece is heartbreaking, but also kind of, as you say, perfect for the character. It's sort of where she was going to end up, and it's almost inevitable by that point. So yeah.
yeah, and I think that like the performance is good enough, right? And the
Mm,
writing is good enough that you know there's this suffering human being inside there. Yeah.
yeah.
Who has a past and who ultimately is alone. And really is alone throughout the film.
Mm,
And is used to being alone, a phenomenal talent, but the drugs, are treating something, right? She's medicating something. You know
yeah.
this. That there
Mm,
you know this, and yet she's also on the surface the consummate star, right? Where, she knows her time is done. What she wanted was, this celebrity, this moment in the sun, and the moment's over. And she has that sort of like consummate star idea of like, yeah, I'm not going to let them see me old, and there's not going to be a story about me 30 years later living in Mexico with 3 kids,
yes.
cooking, uh flour tortillas, like that's not going to happen. I burn brightly and this is my fate.
Mm,
She's, possessed by that sense of fate, and it comes at a heavy price. But
mm.
I think that, she is marginalized at this moment in a way that I think is disturbing to me, but at the same time feels so perfect and even more heartbreaking because of it.
I can see why. The thing is, I can see what you said. The people that I could see, I almost read it in the same way. It's like she's just been, they've just shunted her off, and you have to sort of reflect on it and go, no, no, it's how you said. This is inevitable. This is what was always going to happen. I don't want the scene of her ODing and being found. I don't need that. I want to remember her dancing off into the darkness to be, in her happiness. That's how we're going to leave her. Even like, well, Jack sort of dies off screen. You never see any of them killed. Like, you just hear the gunshot with Jack. It's sort of like, again, they also want to meet their end on their terms. It's only really Manny that runs and lives to sort of see another day of the sort of the key three. Um, I do want to sort of highlight one of the things to sort of to go back to sort of the suppose the technicalities of the story, the bits and pieces. One of the things I sort of found interesting is, again, you there is very little exposition in this film. You have to sort of read. You have to read scenes. It's telling you things about the movie industry and that sort of thing, and how things are coming together. And you mentioned about sort of them trying to reignite sort of Nellie's career, and I think that it's but the reason that the reason she struggles in the first place is fascinating. Is this moment of it's why she has this rage moment with fighting the snake, but she has this sort of like she's from Jersey, so she has this sort of like this Jersey accent, and there's this amazing scene when they're first using the microphones hanging from the ceiling. It's the first sort of sound film that she has done. And then the first thing she does, she walks in and gives it the full Jersey accent and blows all the valves on the mics and stuff. So they've got to set re-prep and do this other thing. And then she misses the mark because she can't be as free flowing as she once was because she's got to be stood a certain distance from the mics. And then this and then that. And the whole scene sort of escalates. And like, you realize what's hilarious is that they had more freedom when it was a silent film because they could be shouting things at people and they can edit things out and all this other stuff. Now they are massively restricted. The microphones pick up everything, so it's silence, and the wrong types of shoes. The cameras have to be in a box because even the whirring of the cameras can be picked up on the microphones and all this other stuff. So, but that whole scene is played through a frenetic sort of like frustration, building frustration. But you watch that scene and technically they're telling you all this information that goes like, this is how the early talkies were made. This is the sort of like the heat from all the lights that were in there. Like she's sweating profusely. Someone dies in a heat box in the cab with the camera from heat exhaustion. Like the sound guy gets pissed off. Like that scene tells you so much. This is that thing of show don't tell, and I do think that this film is very, very good at show don't tell. Like repeatedly, it gives you that information, and the same for her sort of. So, but that scene of like this is why her career is fucked because she's beautiful and she can do all these things and she's free on screen, but her voice is kind of grating and kind of screeching, and it doesn't get over the audiences. And so it's that they then give her that sort of My Fair Lady kind of thing that comes later on. But I thought that scene of showing so much about why her career was in jeopardy, but in the talkies is a brilliant piece of filmmaking.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I also, usually when we see, obviously the transition to the talkies is one of those seminal moments in cinema history that we've sort of seen a million times. I mean, it's there in The Artist. It's sort of like the transition in all of cinema history that gets talked about as, a shock, where really very few actors and even directors, survived that transition. And usually it's because it's written down to somebody's got a bad voice, right? What made somebody a star is now a different set of skills. And a lot of people didn't make that transition. But one thing that I find so fascinating about that depiction is the role of technology and material circumstances that, it's so easy when we talk about art, like you see all these stupid, insulting, frustrating depictions of like, somebody wants to be an artist, and they get a pencil and a piece of paper and they just, they draw and it's like, oh, kid, you've got talent, and then you cut to their painter or something, and it feels so effortless and it always feels disconnected from any particular technology. Or you see F. Scott Fitzgerald drinking and typing, or Mankiewicz,
Hemingway's
drinking
that
and
yeah.
Yeah, and you forget like, oh yeah, that typewriter is a piece of technology, right? I mean, that a pen is a piece of technology. It was a quill before that, and it was a stylus and cuneiform written on tablets before that. These are all specific technologies over the course of human evolution and development. And obviously cinema is the key technology that this movie is about at some point. But technology has this way of becoming invisible. And obviously today, when we can take out our cameras and film something in a better sound than they had, and better images in a lot of respects, we forget this. But that advent of sound, you for I love what it's depicting about how art is dependent upon technology, and how all of those technological innovations are massive, painful adjustments at first. To me, it's not just the usual depiction of the transition to talkies. It's it manages to be entertaining, as you say, brilliantly shot,
Mm.
brilliantly edited, but still, like, it gets at this deeper resonance for me, because of the way it's presented.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree, and I think the depictions of this are difficult to capture at times because I think, as you say, we sort of technology falls into the background. Watching in this made me think of Mad Men, which I watched not too long ago, and that did another good job of a similar thing in the '60s of showing the marketing and the advertising team of that all painted, and they had the artist that drew and painted all the advertising, and the transition then to photography and TV advertising and that sort of thing is a very similar thing. About, as you say, it depicts again like artistic directors and artists just not making that transition and not surviving it because they don't shift with the times and stuff. But I agree that sort of like this thing of technology is fascinating. I think we're going through it now. I think we're seeing it now with like AI and streaming services and all this other things. We say there's lots of things going on that are people going to survive those things and how the sort of industries and stuff change. For me, I think when I think you and I've talked about it. You'll hear someone like Scorsese or Nolan or some others will be like, "My film is made for the cinema screen," and you're going, "Cool." It'll be on the cinema screen for 6 weeks, and then it's going to be on a laptop or a TV or a tablet or even a phone for the next however many years. Let's not restrict ourselves to just thinking in terms of those devices. And so I do see
Yeah, and
that
I
kind of thing now.
and I have the same response to that stuff where, I think that's good. I'm glad you're thinking epically, and maybe there'll be some revival, or private showing, or we'll develop a new technology that'll let us project onto a
Mm.
wall, 60 feet wide. However, right, you can't stand in the way of technology, right? I mean,
Yeah,
think of how
exactly.
many directors swore they would never make a digital movie. Well, they all shoot digitally now.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, even earlier I was talking about celluloid, right?
Mm.
'Cause I'm old. Um, but I mean, you can't stand in the way of, technological change, and you're silly if you do.
Mm. Let's talk about. I mean, although there's a lot that goes on in this film, it's sort of I think we've covered quite a lot of the characters and stuff, but I do want to get to and I do want to talk about the ending of this film. So,
Maybe first we could talk a little bit about, like, race and the way, this movie depicts, like, because there depicts diversity in this sort of like Hollywood milieu of this era. Because
mm,
Manny is obviously racially an outsider, right?
hmm
Um, and obviously, what is her name?
okay,
Lady Faye is, another example. Um, and then there's Palmer.
hmm
Um, and race is obviously an issue here. Um, and it seems that I think we see with Manny how you have to eat a little more shit, so to speak, or put up with more shit, right, to succeed. But that there was a kind of diversity. I mean, we see like Lady Faye is more competent than
yeah,
her competitors. Um, Manny is just better, right? Palmer obviously has to humiliate himself if he wants to continue. But they were all tremendously talented people who sort of like in this nascent Hollywood still are not equal. I mean, we shouldn't
well,
romanticize it that they're equal, but there is a kind of like diversity of nobody's watching, and in truth, none of us give a shit about,
Well,
all of your moral crusade nonsense.
no, exactly. I think one of the things that's really interesting in this film is race and sexuality isn't an issue until it is. And that was the thing that sort of is highlighted by this film is, like you say, Lady Faye openly lesbian in the film. Like she sings, she performs at the beginning of the film during the party, comes out into the audience, kisses a woman, and everyone's sort of like, yay, and it's all good, and everyone sort of respects her, and she's good at what she does. Even as like with Palmer, like he's good at what he does, and he's integrated with the people in the sort of. There's no sort of like, oh, that's the black band. They're just sort of part and parcel of the music scene. They're all there, and the same with Manny. Like, yeah, he's got to push a little bit, but like, there's no sort of like when he does prove himself, like executives are coming up to him and going like, "You're Manny. I want to talk to you. You're good at what you do." There's no kind of thing. It's only later when the moral code, the Hayes Code, and the moralities have changed, and the elite rich are actually having to inject money into the industry. That like they're like, oh, we now recognize that Nellie is now having a relationship with Lady Faye, so Lady Faye is let go, but they do it
Yeah.
under the guise of no one. We don't need because she was basically a writer, and she wrote the interstitial cards that sort of happened in silent films. They could have easily transitioned it into writing and other things, but they just say, "Oh, we don't need you anymore. You're gone." But it's clearly about the fact that she's impacting Nellie's career. And the same with Palmer. Like it's not it's not until they're like, oh, we can't sell this film in the South that his race becomes an issue. Like it was really interesting to me, as you say, that like none of those things were an issue until they were.
Right.
And it's sort of
Yeah, and it does seem that this is connected to um I mean, to the life cycle of a business or an industry that's sort of like, you imagine like, the early days of computing in people's garages, right? Nobody gives a shit, right?
Yeah.
People are doing drugs or, and there are all kinds of different people. Nobody cares, right? But once you're a publicly traded company, suddenly it's like, what is, that executive is doing drugs, suddenly these are all serious issues. Um, and obviously the Hayes Code is a special case, but I do think there's something here about the life cycle of an industry, and also, I am a partier.
Mm.
I believe in the romance and the transcendent glitz of the party. And I think that it is, a symbolic fight against death. It is, symbolic celebration of youth and beauty and joy and all of these wonderful things that I love in life and that, I'm no longer part of as a middle-aged man. Um, but in that context, none of these differences, it's not that I shouldn't say none of them matter, but I also see a way in which, like, as you say, it doesn't matter until it does. But I also see like there is a kind of capital, just as capital winds up destroying those industries, right, and forcing these exterior values on them, which are ultimately dumb, stupid exterior values. Capitalism is what allowed those people to succeed. And I think, unobserved, if somebody says, like, yeah, okay, so, here's this person, they're an outsider racially, they're an outsider because of their sexuality or their gender or whatever. If I can get a little more work out of them, if I can make them, work a little harder, maybe get paid a little bit less, great. Bring them in, fast track them. Let's give it. There's a way in which, like, they shouldn't have to go through that, but those same capitalist forces encourage acceptance and tolerance and diversity, right? In a kind of like unrestricted environment. And yet when that becomes a more restricted environment with more eyes on it, those same forces destroy the exact same thing that they created.
Yes. And
I find that fascinating.
No, I think that partly that's why I was a bit not enough. That's why I feel that like not having the information or the eye put onto the Hays Code and how it was linked with prohibition, alcohol prohibition, and there was a bit of a crossover with all those kinds of things. Like by not, and that introduction of the elite bringing in the money and stuff, like by not having some of those that additional, as you said, sort of like connective tissue that gives you that information, I do kind of feel like you are missing part of the message of why things start to become more restrictive. I mean, there's one point where one of the studio execs just sort of says, morals, morally, we can't do this anymore. Like, your shtick doesn't work anymore. That kind of, we've got to, like repurpose Nelly to be this other thing. But you need to know a little bit about, like, well, there's these bodies that are now coming in, and because we're strapped for cash in the town, we're having to bring in these rich, and these rich are kind of wanting to put the poor in their place, and so they back the Hays Code and alcoholic prohibition, and so we kind of have to dance to their tune to get their money, and so that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. And so that's, to me, as you say, it's fascinating that when it was free and unrestrained, it was creative and it was incredible and this other stuff. But the issue is how capitalism and capital then, it's not so much the money, because the money was there originally. There were people sort of like, the people that were pumping in the money were just as rich and stuff, but they were kind of in on the party. And they were part of building that town, part of building Hollywood. When you have to bring in that external, as you say, sort of those elite rich that are more likely to go to Broadway and go see Jack Conrad's wife than go see Jack Conrad on the screen.
Exactly.
They're the ones that are going like, well, no, thank you very much. We want to see what I'm putting my money into your thing. So what am I getting back? How am I being represented in this? And that's what you sort of see, especially as they sort of start to snub. And but that thing with Nellie when she gets sort of angry with them all and stuff, and it's very sort of My Fair Lady, but also poor sort of what's it Palmer when he's sat on that sofa and people are kind of talking down to him about his music and all this other stuff, and you're like, fucking hell, these people. And I was kind of like, I would. This is where I was like episodic. Like, I know you say you want the script, but for me, I'm going like, I want an episode now that tells like the struggles of these studio execs that we know, some of these characters that are going like, we've got to go cap in hand to these people. They're the only people if we want this party to keep going, we've got to go to these waspy, elite that are actually going to become the
high society types,
the high
right?
society types
who care about what other people think about them, right? Which
yeah.
is the fun. It's
but they also carry that sort of, and it happens here, but this kind of faux, morality of like, oh, but we expect the poor people to live like this, that sort of like, we like them to keep them poor, and entertained, but we don't want them to have too much fun, entertained, but not party. Do you know what I mean? And so I want to see that. I'd love to have seen that struggle of going like, we haven't got a choice, like we are fucked, and we've got to go to these people for that capital. Would have been really kind of interesting.
Yeah, again, I agree with you, and I think that another 15 minutes here or something, where you see a little bit more of the really shocking scandals of the era. I mean, like the Fatty Arbuckle stuff is crazy. There was Chaplin, as well as the real source for Nellie. These were real scandals written up in papers, and it seemed like Hollywood was like, a insane wasteland of drug abuse and murder, and it spurred the Hays Code. And I think in that sequence you could have a depiction of the fact that these people are total hypocrites. The truth is they're all busy getting drunk and having affairs and covering up murders. I mean, you literally have William Randolph Hearst as a character here, as corrupt as they come. But that is all sort of brushed aside for length requirements, and I do agree that some of that connective tissue would help a lot.
And I like the fact that
transitions.
Yeah, exactly. I like the fact that Nellie gets to call them out on their bullshit when she's like, "Oh, you're calling me an animal, like you're wearing a fox around your, and She tells the bear joke and stuff. Like she calls them out right to their face, and I think it's great. But again, it's like if you're not paying attention, if you blink and miss like who these people are supposed to be, if you don't have a bit of the context that sits behind it, then it kind of makes her just look crass rather than sticking it to the man kind of thing. Where you go, like, I get who these people are supposed to be, and that they're snobby and they're waspy and all this other stuff, but there's kind of like you need a bit more of that historical context to really
Right.
hammer it
Well,
home.
there's
But
so much attention to the transition to talkies,
mm,
but there isn't the transition to morality.
yes,
You don't
and,
feel
and capital investment,
those
yeah.
screws turning, right? In the
Mm,
same way. And you really should. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I agree that that would help the movie, and that it does feel those time jumps become increasingly sort of like you have to supply more context yourself.
Mm. But yeah, no, and I'd love to see that difference because I think unfortunately, like Palmer kind of falls out the film after
Hmm.
this thing, and I'd like to have seen more with him when he is like, oh, we can't sell your film in the South if it's considered that you're part of a mixed race band. You've got to be the Negro band, as they call it, and you're like, oh wow, okay, that's crazy. And the fact that he chooses to then put on the black face or the black earth face is kind of like, okay, well, what were the ramifications for that? Like, what's his ending in all this? Like, did he continue to do that? Does he walk away, give up the house and the car and all the money, or I don't know. Like, he kind of they never
Yeah.
kind of resolve his story, which I was
I
kind
sort
of
of
sad
feel
about.
like he kind of walks away,
Mm.
facing more limited options.
He
But you're
goes and
right,
plays in
we
that
don't
small.
follow up. Yeah.
He plays in that small sort of band
Hmm.
like thingy, and I thought that was cool. I was like, oh, that's him getting back to like what he loves. Like he's playing the music because he loves the music. But I was like, yeah, but
I
you're
think
not
that's sort
telling
of
me.
like La La Land, right? Like,
Yes.
you're stuck as a piano player in a bar,
Mm.
that's sort of like who was an also ran kind of
Yeah.
scenario there.
But it never tells me like there's not enough there to go like, oh, he's walked away from the studio system and is now just happy being, this trumpeter in this sort of bar band. But I'd like to have more time with him, I think, as a character to
Fair enough.
explore that
So the
race.
ending.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
let's give it some
this
context.
wonderful sequence where, we shift to
1952,
1952. Yeah.
yeah, and we have Manny returning to Los Angeles, sort of 20 years
For the first
later,
time
mm,
after 20
with
years, right?
wife and child in tow, and he turns up at Kinescope Studios, and basically says like, this is what he's trying to show his wife and daughter where he used to work, and the guard comes up to him, and I love their sort of interaction, really sort of like they have this conversation. He's, oh, I started here last year or whatever, and he says I used to work here, but the guard just kind of assumes. And then you talk about race. The guard just sort of
Yeah.
assumes, oh, you were probably a guard or a runner or whatever. Like, not
Hmm.
that you were one of the heads of the studio. You were a studio exec at one point. Um, and you see the studio looks very different. There's just all this stuff going on, and and this other stuff. And his daughter says, "Oh, I'm bored," so we'll take her back to the hotel. And he goes to walk the streets of 1952 Los Angeles, and he pays 50 cents to go into a cinema just to see. He says, I haven't really hasn't really watched films in 20 years. The whole thing sort of scarred him, and he sits down in a crowded cinema, and all of a sudden, now I haven't googled it. I need to. I'm going to ask you. All of a sudden, he sort of hears things, and he struggles to engage with it. And he falls asleep, and then he hears a line about I forget what the line is now, but there's a line from his life and about I think it's about the talk. It's literally about the transition from silence. There's a film. I don't know if it's made up. I don't know if it's a real film from the 50s that did this, but it's literally like replaying elements of his life, and he sees a scene of a silent actor doing the "I love you, I love you, I love you" scene that Jack Conrad struggled with, and all of a sudden he starts to see these things, and he sees a character that would be Nellie Leroy, a Leroy character being put through the paces of being My Fair Lady to be more approachable or to be more sort of thingies and stuff. And it kind of he breaks down and just starts weeping at the memories of all these people that he knew and the lives that he touched and all this other stuff, and he looks around at all the people enjoying it, and then and mate, I don't know, because I've never watched it, and then it starts with Singing in the Rain, and you
Well,
have
so
the
this is from the 1952 film Singing in the Rain,
oh,
which
is it?
is, you know,
I've never
today
seen that film.
regarded as it was a modest success when it was released, but it was
What's the story of Singing in the Rain then? Because I don't know, I've never.
the story of Singing in the Rain is about the transition to the
Oh,
20s.
really? So I have to
Yeah.
watch that. I'm gonna have to watch that
So it
film.
really is, you know,
Mm.
what you're seeing. So
Just
and
want to see
it's
though. Just
today
sorry.
regarded as like the definitive musical in some
Yeah.
ways.
Oh, I know the song, but the connection is obviously we obviously, is it Fred Astaire that does the Singing in the Rain? I forget who does it.
Yeah.
You can
With
find
Gene Kelly.
Yeah. But obviously, what we saw is in the 30s, or maybe I think it's the 30s. They did a version of Singing in the Rain where they had all these celebrities, almost like Band Aid, but basically all these celebrities on this horrible set in front of like what is the Ark and these other things, and the rain coming down, and they're all in raincoats singing a really kind of dreary version of Singing in the Rain, and they're all sort of shrugging their shoulders in time and this other stuff, and it's very staid and it's
Which is
very
sort of
boring.
like, yeah, I mean,
It's crap,
I'm the
but it's
biggest fan of Bugsley Berkeley, you know,
yeah,
but it's sort of like a late version of a
yeah,
Bugsley Berkeley
yeah.
movie.
Um,
But very used to, but very much about those production values,
mm,
right? And even and those extras are being treated like crap, just like they
yeah,
were in Bugsley Berkeley movies. But there's a million extras, and they're
yeah,
doing amazing things with the cameras, and you know,
mm,
really going for it. And then, of course, the version of Singing in the Rain, which is the one everyone remembers, is much more limited in scope. You know, the ambition is a lot less,
mm,
but it is all has much higher production values, right?
yeah,
So again, you see this kind of like transition of style between, you know, what's wanted by audiences in a different period. I of course prefer the earlier period actually, but you know, especially as I get older,
mm,
yeah, I often go back to that era's films of, you know, the 20s, but in a weird way. I don't
mm,
know why I've been so attracted to it. But, you know, Singing in the Rain is about this transition. And the weird thing is that, you know, I mean, he's watching the mythology of what he went through
mm.
being
His
presented
life,
in the
yeah,
medium that he helped pioneer.
yeah, and you get this all of a sudden, and this made me think instantly as I was watching it of well, basically to describe it, he has this like transcendent moment of cinema, which I'm not gonna lie is brilliant. And it's kind of like you're Singing in the Rain going, but then all of a sudden it starts to skip through cinema. So you get like, here's the films of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I'm going like, and as a nerd, I'm going like, I know that. There's Raiders of the Last Ark. There's this, there's that. It has like T2 in it. It has, and then it gets like jumps to Avatar, and it's kind of like showing you like, here's the technology, here's the cinema, here's what's, you know, kind of proving what Jack Conrad was saying, like this is a medium that will keep going and it keeps going. And it's kind of like it reminded me of it's almost like the it's almost the opposite of Alan Moore's From Hell. So From Hell depicts
Oh,
this
yeah.
moment of Lord, whatever his name is, um being the Ripper, and he has this sort of transcendent moment of realizing that he's giving birth to the 20th century, and he sort of sees this future state in an office, and sort of like, you know, he kind of interacts with it, but it's kind of like this almost like banal kind of future that's sort of in an office and all this other stuff. But it's kind of, you know, but like, and crime and stuff almost doesn't impact them. And it's, you know, there's this, that's that, and
And everything's sanitized. That
yes, exactly. And it's kind of, it's a wonderful moment in that book. But this is almost like this is the exact opposite. This is that transcendent moment of him going, I sort of like was there at the start, and here's what the future holds. And you see all these moments in film, and it's wonderful. And it shows experimental films, and it shows like art films, and it shows popular films, and it shows like blockbusters, and then it sort of transcends into like just colors, and then the ink sort of coming in, and all. It's so well done. Um, and what were your thoughts on how do you sort of interpret it? Like, because to me, it was almost like I felt it as like he's seeing this almost like as a transcendent moment. Like it's not just for the
Yeah,
audience; it's like it's for him, kind of.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I think a few things. I mean, to back up, this whole 52 sequence, I think, is stunning. I
mm,
think is masterful. I think, so often when we talk about movies, we wonder what happens next, right? We're wondering like, why don't they do enough with the denouement? Well, what is this character like 20
this is
years
what you and
later,
I
right?
always say, isn't it? Like, what happens
Yeah,
next? Yeah.
right. Like we can kind of project, sometimes, but usually we're not shown. And I think,
Mm,
in the very best stuff, usually you can project really well, so you don't have to see it. I think sort of like the end of Sopranos is like that, where you know
hmm
exactly what life is going to be for the rest of those characters. You don't have to see it. Um, Here you see it. And so on a personal level, on a character level, Nellie was the love of his life,
mm,
but she was unobtainable. She was incomparable. She wasn't who he was going to marry and have kids with, but and you have no doubt that he loves his wife, and he seems like a good husband and a good father. But while still retaining, male privilege of the time and things like that. I mean, all of this is right there on screen. Um, but he has this past that she barely knows.
mm,
And I find this incredibly painful, the way in which, like, we only know some of each other. We don't fully know each other's thoughts. We don't, even if we know each other's past, we haven't lived it. We don't know what it felt like. We can't imagine it really. Um, we have these whole lives that we've lived that we cannot share with other people. And sometimes, one of the things that isn't talked about in love is that usually most people don't wind up with the love of their lives.
mm.
Usually the person who they love the strongest was not necessarily the best match for them, right? you know and young love is young love, and that doesn't take away from a more abiding adult love, right?
Mm.
That is better for raising kids, right? Nellie would have been a terrible mom. um but uh that pain is something that I rarely see ever depicted
Mm,
in any kind of art, but surely not in cinema. So not only do you have that denouement, but you have this on this personal level, that pain of, the relationship, and of, Nellie, who, you're never going to forget,
mm.
but who was a star that was going to burn out, not really marriage lifelong material. Um, but who, there's a pain there that doesn't go away. Uh, and then combined with that is the pain of having had this life that mattered to you in the cinema. He obviously cared about movies. He might not have had Brad Pitt's, same idealism,
Mm.
but certainly cared about what he did, wanted to, advance cinema, and then has turned his back on it and had another career. And I think this too is something that happens a lot in life that we don't
Mm.
usually see. Uh, so I think before we get into sort of like the whole point about cinema at the end and that experience, what do you think about this depiction of character? Of course, the final shot is him crying.
No, I think you say he likes it. Well, I think one of the things he says early on, the young man he says when he's sort of questioned about, I think one of the first conversations he has with Nelly, she's like, I want to be a star. Like hers is always about her. Hers is about being the biggest starlet and about having all the attention, and that's kind of that. That's a always going to be a crash and burn story. We know that it's a tragedy. You know, that need for attention and desire is never going to end well because, as we've sort of highlighted, like, you know, it's a flash in the pan. Like, it never lasts. Manny's is I want to be a part of something bigger. I want to be a part of something important. And I think, you know, so you get these kind of the three main protagonists, let's say, you get these three very different um motivations. You know, so Nellie's is all about sort of like proving people wrong that she is a star. Like, she says that people have called her fat or ugly or that she's never going to make it. So hers is about being that shining light and being there for as long as possible. And as you say, she burns very, very brightly for a sort of a period of time. Jack Conrad's was about, as you say, was about advancing it. He has this idea of it being something great and it can impact people and it can seize, like, you know, he sees it in a serious way. You know, like the moment in the when they're doing the German expressionist film and the butterfly lands on his shoulder and stuff, and he's like, you know, he comes out and he's like, "Did you the butterfly? Did you see the butterfly?" Like, he kind of gets it. Like, he knows it's kind of a little bit pretentious, but that pretentiousness is kind of the point. That's what he's looking for. He wants to have that. He wants it to be more. He wants it to be considered art rather than just like pulp. Um, and so, and then you also get Manny, which is saying, I want something important. I want to be involved in something important, something big. And what I
But he
find is
doesn't need to be the star,
it doesn't need
you
it
know,
doesn't need to be
and
done.
he's
Doesn't
not as pretentious about, you know,
no
elevating cinema to
no.
stand next to Broadway, you know.
But what we get in that little moment before it transcends into the future of cinema, all three of those desires are recognized in that cinema in 1952. And it's this moment, you have this sweeping, it goes through all the audience, and there's like, there are kids infatuated with the screen, there's a couple making out because they're sort of, you know, young love, and there's these older people there enjoying the film, there's families there, there's all these different people watching this film. And what you see on screen is this is the sort of what the character, the journalist says to Jack Conrad, like, that someone's going to come across you in your films down the line, 30 years, 50 years from now, someone who's put, you know, whose heart hasn't beat yet, will, you know, won't beat before yours stops, all this other stuff. He's there, like, this character, that moment of him struggling to say and convey I love you in a way is in Stinging in the Rain. Like, his story, his anecdote, Jack Conrad is a character that's going to live on. You know, his films will live on. These anecdotes, these experiences. He's actually achieved what he wanted. Like, you know, this thing of elevating it and sort of to the people and to becoming a new art form. As you just said, like, you know, passable success, but now is considered one of the most important musicals of all time. That's part of that journey for Jack Conrad. Like, his desires have been, you know, have been met. The fact that, like, the story of Nellie Delroy in a form is being told in this film again, you know, is for Manny, like, her light still shines, like, as a version of her, this story is always going to be told. I've talked about, like, My Fair Lady, which is exactly the same. It's the same sort of story, you know, and I'm sure there are other films you can see versions of this. Never Been Kissed, you know, with Drew Barrymore. There's all these
Well,
versions of
except
this.
Nelly fails at the My Fair Lady test,
Yeah,
right? You know,
but the story of those characters, you know, live on. These you know, women in cinema and all this other stuff, like, live on. And then for all of it is Manny sitting there in this cinema going, "There's the stories that I was trying to tell. It's a story I was trying to tell of the stories. I was part of something big. I was part of something. I actually made a difference. Decisions that I made on set or with people have led to people sitting in this cinema in 1952. Like, I made a difference. Like, it's not passing. Like, he didn't fail. He was a part of something big. He did make an impact. Things he did between 1927 and 1933 are the reason that that film is on screen and are the reason that those people are in those seats. And you're sort of like, that's, to me, is like, they, in their life, they had tragedy and they never sort of felt that they don't feel they had what they don't, I'm sorry, they never saw the fruits of their labor in the way they wanted. But 20 years later, Manny's sitting there, all of their desires are met post their time in Hollywood. And I just think that's beautiful. I just think that moment encapsulates like why I think film and sort of history in particular, like, we do films like Babylon or Singing in the Rain or other films when done well. I'm not sure about, you know, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but like there are other films that depict these periods in history where you like, even like Boogie Nights and stuff, where you'll go, oh, that's a period in history where these things happen. These people lived, they breathed, and they did these things, and it's important to an industry. I think is really important and really cool, and that's what Manny sees. Is like we weren't shit, we weren't a flash in the pan. Well, we mattered to the people sitting here. We mattered, and that really resonated with me in this ending bit.
Well, I mean, I'm not as a big fan of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
I've not seen it yet. I'm gonna watch it now. But yeah.
but yeah, I agree with you, but I have a slightly different take. I mean, one is that Jack failed,
Mm.
but that Jack's dream is obviously achieved by generations after him,
Yes,
right?
but he allowed that to
Um,
happen. I think he's part of the story,
yes,
the tapestry that allowed that to happen. Yeah.
but so I mean, I think that I mean, this is sort of like I think of the ending of God, what is the Scorsese Gangs of New York,
Yes.
which I think is a masterful ending, where you see, yes, they live these squalid, terrible lives, but you know, these are the hands that built New York. These are the buried, lost stories that were part of a history that ultimately culminated in this vast thing they could not see.
Mm.
Um, so I see some of that. I think that, that pain of generational change, right? Of not seeing it yourself. There's a pain there.
Mm.
So one thing I would emphasize is I agree with you about Manny and how he sort of like realizes this wasn't just this youthful time, right? I really was part of something amazing. Um, but also that's done, and they're all dead, and also nobody remembers us.
Mm.
So, there is that speech to Jack about how be remembered after you're dead, and people will swoon at your image, when you were in your prime. Um, yeah, except we don't even know that those films survived.
Yeah.
We don't know that probably nobody in that audience, nobody, at the studio lot remembers Manny's name. They might know Jack's name, they might know Nellie's name, but only as a footnote. So yeah, maybe they'll be recovered later,
Mm.
rediscovered later, revived at some point among a certain set, but they're all dead. They've all disappeared. All of that burning brightly that Nellie did, and the fame that Jack had, that's gone. That ultimately faded. That's utterly been forgotten. It's buried. But the work that they did generationally allowed the creation of what Jack dreamed of
Mm.
and what Manny dreamed of. And you see in that audience how much cinema affects all of our lives. It affects our dreams, our ideas of love, our aspirations, the way we think about people, the way we think about, romance, different ethnic groups, all of this. Um, it's the tapestry of our lives, and he sees that, in all of the different reactions of the audience, even people bored,
Yeah.
it's so interwoven into our lives now. And I think that ending is so perfect, with on his face, having seen this vision
Mm.
of where cinema's going, which I love. It's such a masterfully directed movie, shot for shot, minute by minute. Um, Finally permits itself this transgression against realism, right? This moment of stepping outside of itself and going for something transcendent, and really putting all the chips on the table and doing something I think really gutsy that I think largely works. And I think in Manny's tears, they're he's not it's a bittersweet
Yeah.
thing, right? I mean, it's happy that he was a part of something and that Jack's dream came true, right? And that he was a part of something, but also sad that none of it worked out.
Mm.
They're all dead. Nellie's gone. Everyone he knew and was a part of is gone. None of them are remembered, but that dream came true. And I think I don't know. I resonate very deeply with that. That sadness over that past. And despite those accomplishments.
I think no, I agree with what you're saying. I think there's something there about um weirdly, I think that it goes back and forward. That moment of the transcendence when he has that vision, because it goes backwards as well. I should highlight, it starts with early cinema. Like it literally starts with the rotoscope, not the rotoscope, the kind of the thing moving around in the sort of the very stacked image, and then it builds up.
Muybridge sort of photographs.
Yes, exactly, and then it builds up to like the first filmed images, which is people working, like someone literally just doing some work, and then people walking around, and it gets more and more and more, and it progresses through, and you do get to see the film of you see like Nellie Leroy crying in the first sort of film, and then you see sort of Jack on film doing his bit, and and again, I love the fact that the film they did of Jack Conrad, when it's the sort of the what's the film? It's all in blue because it's a German expressionistic film, and this is the thing. Like he brought in a German director to do that film, and that was Jack's choice. You hear it was Jack's choice to do that. He wants to bring those progressive things in, and then it works up, and you finally get into like real films, as in sort of like not fictionally made by the characters in the film, but like you start to see other films sort of slotted in until you get to modern cinema. It did make me think of two things. One is how fast we have gotten with cinema, and you and I basically, I mean, especially let's say with Stories Out of Time and Space in particular, but I do it with 20th Century Geek, is we'll go back and be like, oh, let's look at this film, and then we'll assess it and we'll talk about it and we'll review it, performances and directs and themes and how well it did and so on and so forth, what we took from it. And you and I have gone back as far as the 30s. Like we've talked about B movies and we've talked about big movies and like art movies, and we've talked about all kinds of things. I think it's important to do so. But one of the things I find more and more today is, again, much like that sort of period in the 20s, of regurgitating as quickly as possible. So I'm going to sound old manish right now. I kind of miss when films had a massive, or more films had a massive cultural impact. And I'm a big fan of culture of physical media, and so I can go like I can quickly lean in and go, oh, I've got this Vincent Price film, or I can go right, I'm going to watch Ghostbusters on Blu-ray, or I can go and watch this Arnie film, or I'm going to go and watch Jaws or whatever. Like I've got those films to lean on my physical media collection, and I think now with streaming and stuff, my concern is it goes the way of those early. You don't own those films on streaming, and you are pushed to watch certain things. They'll be like, oh, here's the newest film, here's the latest film. It's kind of crap, but it's the latest film, so everyone's going to talk about it. And then you finish, and the thing is, do you want to watch? And you get pushed onto the next thing. And we've already seen it. Like if that film doesn't do well, or no one's watching it because it's taking up server space, it's gone. It's gone. You do not own that film. That film is gone. You cannot watch that film again. It was recently like a film. It was the film 28 Days Later, the Danny Boyle film, with the announcement of 28 Years Later coming out this year in 2025. Everyone was like, oh yeah, I need to go back and watch 28 Days Later, only to find not available on any streaming service. Like it just wasn't available, and so DVD copies of it were going for 50 to 60 pounds on eBay and stuff. I actually own a copy of it, so it was all right. But this is what I'm saying. I feel that, like, what this film sort of highlights is the beauty and the impact of cinema as something that can have an impact, and people put their lives into, and they put sort of like effort into. But it's kind of been commodified into regurgitation of like content rather than film. And so I feel that Babylon, the ending of Babylon in particular, is important because I do watch it and go, There's a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's a scene from E.T. There's a scene from Terminator 2. There's a scene from Avatar. There's a scene from this. There's a scene from that. Like I'm recognizing and going, I love them films. And that's the kind of thing where I'm going like, in 20 years' time, are people going to look at that from the films from like the 2020 to 2030 and go, oh, that's so and so, that's so and so? Or is it they're just going to be shot out and, they're in the cinema for 2 weeks or they're on streaming for 2 weeks and then they're gone? And, we're not going to have, are we back into an era? We're not going to have those stars. You're going to have someone who might be burned brightly and disappear, or, are we going to have like Robert De Niro's and Sigourney Weavers and stuff who sort of have these long careers of going, oh, they've done amazing films. I do wonder, are we falling out of a period of great cinema?
Well, I think that we're maybe not falling out of a period of great cinema, but I think that uh, the transition to streaming and especially in the last 20 years, how many great films have been made?
Yeah.
How many really great films have been made since 2000? I mean, probably as many as ever, but they don't have the same cultural impact that they used to.
Hmm.
And part of that is that there are so many streaming services that so much is being produced. I mean, we were talking before the show about, how influenced Ronald Reagan was by
Yeah.
Rambo. Not to mention we've talked on Stories Out of Time and Space about, the day was it the day after
Mm, mm.
how much these movies changed. I mean, everybody saw Terminator 2, right? Everybody saw
Yeah.
uh Schindler's List. Everybody saw these movies, and they moved generations, and
Mm,
that's just not possible in the same way. And I think largely because of um how diverse the landscape is, but also because there's been an even greater shift in terms of what's popular versus what's artistic.
mm.
And in the 60s and the 70s, you know, yeah, there was always artsy stuff that didn't get great audiences and popular stuff that wasn't regarded very strongly, but there were more breakouts. Now it's just not possible to have a breakout.
Mm.
Um, you know, you just have this sort of, corporate pablum that some of it's good, some of it's not, but I mean, when was the last time you saw big international releases for, some artsy international movie that like everybody talked about?
Yeah.
It's pretty rare these days. Um,
Yeah.
and maybe that's just like cinema has just gotten as old as the novel, where, you think about this and you think like, well, we're 100 and, you know, 20 years or so into cinema as an art form, certainly over 100 years. Maybe that's the point at which, you just have the penny dreadfuls that everyone watches and that everyone reads, and then you have the artistic novels that really are going to last that really very few people read. Um, maybe that's just an evolution of the art form. But I think that the movie itself, in its depiction of technology, um, gives you a way to interpret this, right?
Yeah.
Says, because I'm not scared of technology. I don't think that streaming is the death of cinema as an art form. It's just another change that we have to adapt to. And it might be part of a maturing into something closer to the novel, at this point in its life. Um, I don't know, but it's certainly not something that I think has ended great art films. I think that ironically, this movie is one that, I would like people to be watching as a masterpiece 100 years from now.
Mm.
If this movie is not on, the short list of um movies that people are watching in college courses or whatever the hell we have, if we have much of a society in 100 years, you know, um, something's gone terribly, terribly, terribly wrong.
No, no, I think it's
Because
an interesting point. I don't want to just to hone in on that, but I think you're right about this film. I think it's an interesting. I think it's going to be a weirdly like a grower. Like I think it's been a couple of years. Was it 2022? This film came out.
Mhm.
I think it's one of those that will get weirdly sort of I think that the length of it is kind of kind of when it released, kind of 3 hours and some is kind of prohibitive about for cinema releases. So it was always going to be a problem. But I'm just having a quick look of like movies of 2024 because I thought in my head I was like, oh, let's think about this, and I was like, none of them's jumped to mind. I mean, we're literally just starting 2025, so to think back, but like the biggest film of the year was Wolverine and Deadpool, really, but that was the culmination of things, and it's kind of like flash in the pan. Like I don't think anyone's going to be talking about it in 2025 or beyond. It kind of like, and literally
I
someone
mean,
asked me the
well
other day,
made pablum, but pablum and filled
yeah,
with references that you know,
well,
like if you think this doesn't have connective tissue to explain stuff, how is anyone going to watch Wolverine,
for
Deadpool
example,
versus Wolverine and be like, oh, remember that Gambit movie that wasn't made? You know,
so
like you've got to
perfect
know
exa-
that. Makes
perfect
sense.
example of that. I was asked over the Christmas break whether or not a 14-year-old should watch it, and I was like, well, it's kind of racing, it has this and that. That's up to you to sort of. And they were like, okay, cool. They've never really watched any of the superhero films before. Will they get it? And I was like, oh no, no. This is not an entry level film. Like, no, no, no. They need to go back and watch this. And there's jokes around stuff from like they'll get confused because Chris Evans is Johnny Storm and not Captain America, and they were like, oh, they've watched a couple of like the MCU films. I was like, oh no, 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 this isn't an MCU film. It needs to be it's this and this and this. And the person looked at me and was like, what are you talking about? So you're like, right, like it carries with it weight that goes with it. But what I found interesting is I'm a horror fan. I do lean into horror, and there was an interesting thing that happened last year. Films like Longlegs seemed to hit a bit of a cultural sort of point, as did Terrifier 3 and The Substance. And so there's kind of films just from that where they're the films, I think you're right, where people are going to go back in like 5, 6, 10 years and be like, oh man, that film from 2024 was great. And it'll be one of those rather than, you know, um, um, Megalopolis or, well, that'd be interesting one to see what, but like Never Let Go or Joker, or even Alien Romulus, which I think is going to fall by the wayside and be forgotten,
Hmm.
or Trap, or whatever. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think this film could be rediscovered, and I also think it should be looked at.
Oh, it will be.
I think it should be looked at from a historical as well as a sort of a um, theatrical and sort of like content and film studies kind of perspective. It's got so much interesting stuff in it. But yeah, I mean, I would say, ain't gonna lie, I don't think this is one I'm going to go back to anytime soon. I've enjoyed talking about it a great deal. I think there are some great performances in this. I respect everybody in the cast. I think this is wonderfully performed and has some incredible scenes. However, I think as a piece at 3 hours and 10 minutes, I
Yeah.
had to watch it in two sittings because it was just a bit much. Like I was like, okay, I'm watching this. I can kind of do it. Um, and also like I think some of it so jarringly flips between humor and tone and other things that I honestly think this would have been. I think if this had been a HBO Max series, I think this would have been winning all the awards. I think if
Hmm.
this was given like this is what 3 hours. If this was given 6 episodes or even five to give you those
Or even
5 hours,
four, or
yeah,
something
even
like, I mean,
four
the Hateful
maybe.
Eight was,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think you'd be looking at something that was winning all kinds of awards
Hmm.
because it would have those little extra bits in that connective tissue that we talked about that would make this make so much more logical sense in certain scenes that I think this would be like, oh, you've got to see this thing. This is a massive, massive hit as a an expanded um limited series rather than a movie. Um, but yeah, it's still beautiful done, and I think the director does a fantastic job of especially some of those scenes, choreographing some of those insane scenes early on. Is I can imagine sort of like migraine inducing. So it's a feat in and of itself, really. Any final thoughts then for Babylon before we sort of
Yeah,
do wrap up?
I want to, just talk a little bit about my personal connection to it and
Mm,
then, sort of wrap up. I mean, I relate so strongly to this film. Um, first of all, my father was a film scholar in the very beginning days of film scholarship, of taking film seriously as an art form to be studied at the university. And he was really in the first generation of people who did that and helped pioneer on the academic side, the academic version of this movie. Um, so I grew up with cinema history and also with my dad being a pioneer in his own sort of way. And, comic books were kind of my version of that. And I was a pioneer in taking comics seriously as an art form when nobody else did. Or a small handful of us did. Um, and, really, Segwart was incredibly influential in doing that,
Mm.
in the 1990s, even when very few people were doing that. Um, but then also I was an ambitious writer myself. And I went to college and I was a depressed outsider. And especially in my junior and senior years, I found a community and I partied hard, right? So like my Babylon is sort of like the college party, the party you see. That's sort of like an exaggerated version of what, every Wednesday night was for me. I mean, there were orgies, there were drugs, there was, wild insanity, group hallucinations. I mean, running into a burning building at one point. Lots of crazy stuff and lots of fascinating, insane, young, vibrant, intelligent, creative people. Um, and now I'm a middle-aged man, and all of that is in the past, and I remember all of that uh excess and joy, and those were parties where everybody kissed everybody else,
Hmm.
everyone was arriving in weird costumes, and nobody cared what ethnicity anybody was or sexuality anybody was. It very much had that sort of free-flowing thing, and our lives were ahead of us. There were tons of rich kids and tons of money around, and um and it seemed like the party would go on forever. And of course, it doesn't,
Mm.
and now I'm Manny crying alone in a movie theater. It's quite true. But so I resonate with this, on a number of levels, very deeply. Um, I want to say that, I'm not, I have not been the biggest fan of Damien Chazelle, who's the director of this. I am like probably the one person in the world who does not like Whiplash. Um, I mean, I think it's well acted. It's an hour and a half, and it really should
Mm.
be an hour long because there's 30 minutes of close-ups of symbols and stuff. Like, I cannot stand that stuff. And it also has weird jumps in terms of time and stuff. It sort of like would be a really good 1 hour movie. I think in that case it needs half an hour taken away from it.
Mm.
La La Land is kind of great, but hasn't stuck in my memory. And but he had enough um capital in Hollywood to get this movie made. Um, and this movie was a terrible flop to such a degree that it's unclear that he'll ever be able to make anything else. Certainly nothing on this scale, anytime soon. And it breaks my heart because I think, this is one of those rare movies that to me is just, um, no matter how often you might want to come back to it. I mean, I personally sort of think like it takes a piece out of me, and I sort of love it minute by minute, but kind of don't want to watch it more than every 6 months or so.
Hmm.
But I do want to come back to it, and I always have gone back to it and watched it and recommended it to people. I think this is, one of the real masterpieces of cinema, certainly of the 21st century, and it sort of breaks my heart that in the history of cinema here is this talented director who made this magnum opus that's like um a hill that he died on, that I think is undoubtedly a fantastic film. um you know no matter how whether you want to focus on certain flaws or not, but is a titanic accomplishment. Directed within an inch of its life. A great masterful illustration of a lot of what cinema could do, and yet kind of destroyed his career. Yeah.
Well, maybe. I think, we'll see. I think, maybe you'll get a smaller, something a bit more. We'll see. Because I do think he's a good director. I think he has vision and he's clearly talented and very, very good at what he does. I think, um, and I think, if Joel Schumacher keeps getting jobs, then,
Well, he's dead.
well, no, yeah.
Yeah.
Who made Elvis?
It- oh,
'Cause that was another film that
God.
sprang to mind when I was watching this.
Oh, God.
Um,
Baz Luhrmann.
Baz
And
Luhrmann.
I
That's what I was
love me
thinking.
some Baz
I
Luhrmann.
know you like Baz Luhrmann. I'm a little bit more, you know.
And I loved Elvis.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was less taken with that film as well. But he's another one where you go like, yeah, you're clearly talented and you think, but you're kind of overindulging on this.
yeah,
What
potentially.
one thing we haven't said in this film, and I do want to sort of wrap up on this point,
Yeah.
is, because we talk about the visuals, it's about Hollywood, it's about film. Can I say about how great the score is for this film? The music in this film is excellent, excellent score. And so it's very sort of it keeps up that frenetic energy throughout a lot of it, as well as having those sort of heartfelt moments. Um, feels very much of the time. It has that sort of 20s kind of sort of beat and everything. It's a fantastic score, absolutely phenomenal. I just wanted to sort of mention that as well as a vinyl piece. Really, to knock it on the head. If anything for me, that was the glue that held it all together. So in many pieces was the music. So it'd be anyway. I think we've run out of time.
Well, thanks for indulging me.
No, I think
I hope you're glad you watched it.
I am. No, I may not be his biggest fan, but it's one of those I'm going like, no, I'm glad I watched this. I think, there was something about this film that I may even come back and it's going to stay with me. There'll be scenes in this and stuff I want to think about, and performances that I think are fantastic. So it's a good film it's a good film that was a bit of a slog to get through. I think that's the way I'm going to sort of phrase it. But I do like certain things in it. But yes, I'm not sure what's coming next for 20th Century Geek. There's some things in the pipeline, so we shall see what is on the next episode. I'm not entirely sure at the moment. See what I've got in the set up. But for now, Julian, thank you very much for joining us to babble about Babylon.
Always an honor to be here, my brother from another mother.
Yeah, no, this has been a great one. I've enjoyed this one. And I'm sure I did think like this could be part of a series, and maybe I'll bring it back. We'll do other films about Hollywood. I think I do want to watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'd even watch Singing in the Rain to do that comparison and sort of to come back and talk about that at some point. I think it'd be interesting to talk about those.
Well, what I'd really like is to do sort of like our favorite movies, like maybe like our over the course of a long span, because we have so much to do, but sort of like our 12 each favorite movies of all time that are non-sci-fi,
Yeah,
and sort of slowly cover them and share those experiences with each other.
that'd be interesting. Yeah, that'd be yeah, that'd be ace. I think some of the non-sci-fi. Oh, that's a yeah. We'll be doing that. We can sort of fit that in. But on that front of sci-fi, don't forget that you can see more of Julian and I on Stories Out of Time and Space, and we are starting up. You are getting all of our backlog at the moment of all the stuff that was on Patreon. All of our Patreon exclusives is now sort of on the main feed for a period. We are going through all of our sort of additional movies that we've done for previous seasons, as well as the continuation of our Twilight Zone releases. So at the moment, Stories Out of Time and Space is every week. It is a weekly release. 1 week is Twilight Zone. Another week is an episode of our Patreon backlog. So we're just going through all that stuff for some fantastic reviews and stuff we've done of films that we did, and they're old, but we just want everyone to hear it. It's time for it to come out into the light and for everyone to hear it. But on the Patreon, that doesn't mean we're not doing anything on there. We're actually ahead of the game. And on the Patreon, it probably would have already been out by the time we started this. We are starting our own, the continuation of Stories Out of Time and Space on there. We're going to be doing a full retrospective of RoboCop before we get into our next sort of seasons and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to be doing. So go check out for more of Julian and I talking about things. Go and check out our Patreon. There's a link down below for so much stuff on there as well.
I was going to joke that, like, it's a great transition from this to, RoboCop to,
Yeah.
a guy in a suit killing people. But then I thought, no, actually, the first movie, the first couple of movies, kind of are, artistic triumphs
Oh,
and doing weird stuff.
I fully endorse the fact that Manny would have been fully on board with making RoboCop at any point in history. Yes. Anyway, for now, Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And we shall see you on the next episode.